Good evening, everyone. I'm Keith Crumwoody, Dean of the Architecture Division at California College of the Arts. Thank you for joining us tonight. At CCA, we understand land acknowledgement as a transformative act meant to confront our place on native lands and to build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacies. California College of the Arts campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you're joining us virtually today. Tonight's event is the last lecture in our Fall 2020 Architecture Lecture Series titled Remaking, through which we are bringing important contemporary thinkers and makers to CCA to reflect upon the work we must do now to co-imagine a just and equitable future. Tonight's lecture by Sean Canty also unofficially serves to kick off a series of events in the spring that will mark 100 cumulative years of interior design and architectural education at CCA. In that light, it's a real pleasure to welcome Sean, a 2012 graduate of our Bachelor of Architecture program, back to CCA. Sean is currently an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, the principal of Studio SC, his own practice, and one of the founding principals of Office 3. You can learn more about the series and find stories by and about our students, faculty, and alumni at our new content channel, Scaffold, which can be found at scaffold.architecture.cca.edu. And now I'll hand things over to Craig Scott, CCA Professor of Architecture, who will introduce Sean Canty. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, and hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. In what seems like an incredibly short time, he has become an important voice among his generation of emerging architects, producing a compelling, beautiful, and relevant body of work. I'm not at all surprised. From my first encounter with Sean as a student at CCA, it was plainly evident he was fully dedicated to the kind of artful, in-depth investigation of form, space, and material that is the stuff of great architecture. Work from Studio Sean Canty and his collaborative partnership, Office 3, founded in 2016, has already gained significant recognition, including being a finalist in the prestigious MoMA PS1 Young Architects program competition, completing the Welcome Pavilion on Governor's Island, and exhibiting work at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Sean's other recent work includes an impressive series of projects that explore the reconsideration of residential typologies. Combining playful transformation of type with geometric precision, these projects reveal a thoughtful architecture full of perceptual payoffs and spatial discoveries. Importantly, of late, this design work is being carried out alongside Sean's increasing participation in social equity efforts. Last summer, in response to the racial inequality protests, Sean compiled an Instagram stories list of Black creatives. He then created an Airtable Universe links archive called 200 plus Black creators, based on the Instagram stories to help others discover and continue to follow them. Through such endeavors, Sean is helping amplify the voices of Black architects, designers, artists, and intellectuals who continue to make a meaningful impact in our built environment and cultural landscape. These efforts make me incredibly proud of Sean, as does the fact that he earlier played such a critical role as a key designer for Iwamoto Scott over a number of years working with us, starting out as an intern between semesters at CCA, then becoming a senior designer on a wide range of projects in our office. Sean is currently assistant professor at Harvard Graduate School of Design after having taught previously at CCA, UC Berkeley, and Cooper Union. He received his MArch from Harvard GSD and obviously his BArch from California College of the Arts, and he is the recipient of the Richard Rogers Fellowship for 2020. I'm very excited to see and hear tonight's lecture, so please join me in welcoming Sean Canty back to CCA, even if virtually via Zoom. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you, Craig, for that really wonderful introduction. Thank you, Keith, and the Department of Architecture for inviting me back to the school, although under these circumstances. It's really happy to be back in a place where a lot of my formative years as a young adult and a student formed who I am today. So thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. And can you see this full screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So tonight's talk is a lecture I've been giving called Geometries Placed. And as mentioned, I have two parallel practices, Studio SC and Office of Three, an experimental collaborative between myself, Stephanie Lynn, Ryan Golenberg. All three of us are each educators and designers based in New York City, Boston, and San Francisco. And over the years, we really valued productive feedback and conversations amongst each other, initially becoming friends at the Office of Middle Scott Architecture, and then staying friends at the GSD, and then deciding to kind of start a kind of experimental practice together where we can still hold meaningful conversations around design and projects that deal with collective engagement in the public realm. The work that I've been pursuing through my own practice, Studio Sean Canty, is I'm interested in thoughtful engagements with building typologies and geometries, and looking at the ways in which questions of combination and juxtaposition aim to rethink spaces of ordinary life. And so this happens through a variety of scales, from accessory dwelling units to residences of low and high resolution, to looking at research into irregular urban infills or kind of forgotten sites within post-industrial cities, to rethink and maybe question collective housing. The work is also inspired by both the ordinary and the exception, as well as the intimate and the playful. And looking at moments of collectivity and gathering, and how that's explored through the context of domesticity, including typological investigations of the courtyard and negative space, as well as the interplay between perspectival geometries and domesticity. And more recently, I've been looking at how the combination of existing architectural typologies and some new and some ordinary geometries can leverage traditional construction methods. So rethinking how clapboard siding could produce curvature, brick barrel vaults, the organization of light solar panels, or standing seam metal siding. My current interest is in geometry, and it begins with revisiting the role of conic and developable surfaces within stereoatomic projection. This research serves as a means to rationalize doubly curved surfaces, as in the case of Guarini's development of a torus, by intersecting it with a series of cones. And so on this stereoatomic trait on the right, this was a toroidal vault that's doubly ruled, and a series of conical patches was used to kind of approximate this surface for constructability. And by stereoatomic projections, I'm also referring to types of orthographic drawings that address a concision of information and measurement. They use as few lines as possible in order to compress a lot of information onto a single sheet of paper. These were frequently used by stonemasons within the 18th century, and often represent the cutting away of stone or something solid. And I'm interested here in the way in which these drawings suggest the translation to our contemporary condition of the tectonic. Formally, I'm really interested in how piecing together conical geometry can choreograph these figures from a single shape and also allow for the oscillation between two different readings of one thing, as in the case of Gabbo's translucent variation on a spheric theme. Here we can see a kind of dual reading between the smooth and the coarse, between the axial and rotational, and between circle and line. I'm also interested in the cone for certain kinds of geometric adjacencies embedded within it. It is perspectival in nature, widening at the base and terminating at a point. And there are adjacencies between point, line, and circle, as well as adjacencies of curvature, what we might call stretched circles, the hyperbola, the parabola, and the ellipse. The use of conical geometries on the one hand is a reaction to a high degree of formal complexity that digital tools allow architects to create and to post-rationalize. But by working with these geometries in particular ways, one can achieve a high degree of formal complexity that's still amenable to construction methods. And so within my own work and research, looking at the ways in which doubly rolled surfaces, such as a sphere, are intersected by singly rolled surfaces, like the cone, to produce new kind of figural intersections. Or in the reverse, where a singly rolled surface is intersected by a doubly rolled surface, like a hyperbolic paraboloid. In the context of my experimental practice Office 3, we explored these geometries prior to our PS1 submission in a speculative project called Gallery of Figures, where we were attempting to use these plastic forms to reconstruct certain kinds of architectural elements, but in a kind of defamiliarized way. And so in this particular intervention, looking at a partition that also formed a canopy, a vaulted surface that bridged between two thresholds, and a stair that occupied, or a very figural stair that occupied the corner. And was very much interested in how we might begin to kind of reproduce the kind of concision of a stereotomic trait, in which we were able to kind of describe the process in the formation of each architectural intervention through a kind of super drawing. I'm also interested in, let's say, questions of tangency, or adjacency between curves and adjacencies between curves and lines. And lastly, the way in which geometry choreographs certain programmatic explorations, situating new adjacencies between both programs and forms. And so this evening, I'll show some recent work organized in the categories of pavilions and houses. The pavilions can perhaps be seen as proto-architectures, abstractions that are rehearsals in form, representation, and for me, very important as a way of kind of continually speculating and positioning the work. These explore the potential of ordinary and known geometries and their subtle transformations to produce newness. The first investigation, titled Anomalous Corners, started by way of revisiting Robin Evans' seminal text, Drawn Stone, in his chapter Unfolding, and his reconstruction of the trump at Annette Castle in his book, The Projective Cast. In this text, Evan relates the role of drawing and representation in the formal material assembly of stone within the 18th century. In this particular instance, the techniques of stereotomic projection offered the architect methods to understand, describe, and produce new formal compositions with masonry. Key to this investigation is the what's called the trump, T-R-O-M-P-E, which was a splayed conical surface which often supports a small tower. The trump at Annette Castle was designed by the architect and geometer Philibert Delorme, and it leveraged two codes. On the one hand, that of the architect in the classical canon, and on the other hand, the traditions of craftsmanship that was secretive to stonemasons. And both of these two things allowed it for it to arrive at its exceptional form. This developed surface drawing of the trump at a net illustrates the salient features of conical geometry, its developability, or the ability to unroll flat, and the formal complexity enabled by the movement between 2 dimensions and 3-dimensional form. We might speculate that the drawnness of drawn stone is how DeLorme handled the edge of the net trump, constructing a squiggle, a doodle, a sketchy edge, a continuous gesture of compound curvatures and tangencies, materializing drawing by means of projection. As an elaboration of this technique, I decided to explore my own anomalous corners, substituting DeLorme's misbehaved edge for misbehaved compositions of trumps and their supporting towers. And I will say that this research was catalyzed and developed in the context of producing a drawing for CCA's exhibition drawing codes by Adam Marcus and Andrew. And so as an elaboration of this technique, I decided to explore my own anomalous corners. Each occupies a corner in a unique way, leveraging geometric tangency to smear, to rub out, and to blend the cylinders into the flatness of the corner, producing arrangements which are paradoxically protruded and negated at once. And this was the final drawing produced for the show, which begins to suggest material organization through line density and line type in order to suggest a method of curved or flat panelization. The next project, the Pavilion, was initially designed for an invited competition organized by Materials and Applications for an urban site in LA. Since that proposal, I evolved this exploration to another site and program while still maintaining a kind of similar scale to the competition proposal. The competition called for explorations of how construction methods may inform design techniques. The proposal was inspired by a long history of turret construction within the American building stock. Here we can see a precedent of Frank Furness's National Bank of the Republic, which is another example of turret construction, in this case masonry, but one in which Furness's radical recombination of styles merges the turret into a unified whole, along with the rest of the facade. The conjunction of the turret and other elements of the facade highlights the way Furness celebrates the relationship between each parts to one another. And for Furness, this approach was the foundational to the American landscape. And so here we can see in a kind of infill building in the urban context, the way in which the turret allowed for the project to kind of negotiate property lines that weren't quite frontal to one another, but produced this kind of amazing amount of compositional play within a very compressed footprint. And so while turrets are typically adjacent to a building container, the Folly Pavilion makes this auxiliary architectural element integral to the design. Misalignments between type and geometry happen by embedding the large conical turret within a vernacular shed container. Asymmetry and hierarchy are introduced through a subtle distortion of the plan, which produces 3 openings that are relatively similar in size, one that is at the scale of the door. The plan gestures towards both the axial and the rotational by way of 4 pinwheeling walls, which support the conical turret above. And so in this final plan drawing, you can see the space has a small, simple program with a semicircular bench for seating, a reflecting pole that can be covered, and a performance can be covered to produce a performance base, and then the 4 pinwheeling walls that support the dome above. The structure is made of a combination of wood and metal framing, and then the conical turret was conceived of as a stressed skin. As one moves around the pavilion, each object, the shed or the turret, is revealed in varying ways, framing or occluding each other. From above, the gabled roof appears to be in an entanglement. Below, we can see that there are two sibling oculi, one in the shape of a teardrop and one in a wedge shape that choreographs light into the space below. This developed surface drawing shows how those figures were described and inscribed in 2D and then projected back into 3D. From the exterior, what you aren't seeing is more important than what you are. What you aren't seeing is that there are two sets of oculi inscribed into the gable, the other inscribed into the cone, one inscribed into the gable and the other inscribed into the cone. And then here, how material siding might bring continuity between the interior figure and the exterior shed. The playful pavilion creates a small room for informal gathering performances and conversations. Inside, light is directed through the large exterior openings. And then lastly, in this image here, we can see engagement between the exterior oculi here and then the interior oculi that brings light into the interior. The houses explore the simulation of different spatial experiences of everyday living spaces through non-everyday shapes. Geometries are placed to transform familiar typologies towards something unfamiliar. The houses also deploy a different technique of tangency, one that allows for the apposition and fusion of dissimilar shapes and plan, as in the case of Veronese's Campo Marzio, in which the radical juxtaposition of form and type are extremely packed to form a new urban imaginary for the city of Rome. With these drawings here for a show called Drawing Improper at the University of Colorado in Denver, I was required to make a dutiful drawing and a misbehaved drawing. The misbehaved drawing uses tangency in two different ways to bring continuity between figures by merging the parts of the drawing into a whole and to create distinction through minimal adjacency, touching at isolated points. Fulfilling the brief, I was trying to collapse two projections into one frame, a bird's eye and a worm's eye oblique drawing, whereas the dutiful drawing refers back to traditions of well-behaved orthography. Together, these drawings work to form a new architectural imaginary composed of axial and centralized figures. And so the first house I'd like to show today is the Janus House, which contains two residences in a single volume. The plan of the Janus House arrives at its composition by merging two key traits from recognizable housing types, the axiality of a dog trot home and the centrality of a courtyard typology. The house's twin logic is established through the transformation of the dog trot. The dog trot is characterized by a covered open space and two gabled wings. While the dog trot is inherently symmetrical in plan, the Janus House signals this organization, but it's immediately altered. Public spaces are concentrated towards the front of the house, while the two residences concentrate private spaces to the rear of the house. The organization of the house takes inspiration from other twin organizations, like the churches at the Piazza del Popolo. These might be perhaps the most famous explorations of twinning. Commissioned by Pope Alexander, the churches were designed and developed by a series of architects from Carlo Rinaldi to Carlo Fontana, and then finally Bernini. The exterior forms belie their differences in plan. One church is derived by a circular plan with the centralized axes. The other has an elliptical plan that is near axial. The elliptical plan of the first church creates a stronger relationship to the piazza, while the circular plan of the second church foregrounds a more internal organization. In the Janus House, the two residences occupy a left and right wing, whose boundary line is blurred by the relationship of public and private spaces. The insertion of the circular courtyard complicates the didactic parity of the dog trot plan and introduces the richness into the spatial experience of the house. And so just kind of quickly walking through the plan, that both residences enter under a kind of shared elliptical awning. There's minor and subtle differences between the left and right side. The left side houses a double-story, two-story kind of like loft living space with a study in the back. The right side is kind of closed off from the courtyard in terms of the living spaces. It has a small circular staircase in the back that leads to a mezzanine over the guest bedroom. And then both of the bathrooms and bedrooms overlook the small courtyard. The sublimation of this typological feature in geometric plasticity is the first in a set of Baroque techniques applied to the American house forms, exaggerating and contorting primitive forms which emphasize parts within a whole, and restrained introversion, which conceals the relationship of interior spaces. Historically, these sensibilities drew attention to the Baroque orchestration of mass and volume, as well as the play between light and shadow. One of the main differences between the Janus House and a typical dog trot house is that there is no open breezeway between the two house fronts. Instead, the gable volumes pinch together at the front elevation, first compressing the formerly open space to zero. These are a series of descriptive diagrams showing the relationship to the roof and the circular drum below. Here, kind of piecewise stitching together of cone segments with the ruled surface, and then the inscription of the circular drum and plan. And then these are a series of exterior renderings, exploring questions of materiality and opening, and how standing seam metal siding can be used both for as the primary material for the facade, but also the material for the roof as well. The circular courtyard reads as an almost execution of the literal three-way, caught at the end of an acute angle and plan. In this way, the courtyard acts in tandem with the exteriorized dog trot awning, and together both typologies enable a mixture of organizational gestures between center and edge. And so these are some interior perspectives. This is a kind of throughway between the left and right side of the house that can be closed off through a sliding door. Here we can see how the residence on the left has a kind of second story mezzanine just beyond, while the one on the right has a fireplace that separates the living room and the dining area. The art farmhouse was a quick charrette that we did this summer for a multi-family residence in upstate New York. There was an existing house on the property that was meant to act as a kind of art object in conversation with other art pieces throughout the site. The proposal was that the new house would combine two residences for two different couples. And while the estate was pretty large and the main house was in a clearing, an open clearing, the new residence was to be tucked away from public view. And so we were really interested in a kind of approach that the landscape architect had implemented throughout the site to produce a series of concentrated open areas through circular tree clearings, and was really interested in the ideas of these kind of exteriorized rooms produced by trees in the round to view the experience of art. And so the client was quite interested in somehow mapping that idea of landscape onto the architecture, and we began to do a series of kind of diagrams looking at the relationship between an individual and collective through a centralized figure like the circle, and looking at the way in which a circle can be subdivided into different parts for programs, either through a radial organization through packing with orthogonal forms or subdividing it in a Cartesian-like fashion. And then we propose a series of studies of thinking about the ways in which the two residences might inhabit the same massing at various locations within the area of the site. And so these are just kind of a series of diagrammatic studies, just maybe a little bit more about the process and how we work. But here we're thinking about that that two curved gables would produce a kind of exterior courtyard form. How the families could be connected and close together by conjoining a single bar and a round courtyard that housed all the public functions. Or how we might split the two residences sectionally and conjoin them at the back through the piecing together of smooth surfaces or conical geometry here. Here they're connected and apart. And here they're connected and close together. And so looking at different ways in which axial and centralized figures might produce spaces of collectivity, but also allow certain kinds of degrees of programmatic separations between the two families within a single volume. That project led us to a kind of ongoing research project called the Roundhouse, which is a kind of prototypical home using both stressed skins and cross-laminated timber. The tightness of the budget of that project and the particularities of site forced us to kind of look into mass timber and design for manufacturing and assembly as a kind of research project to explore in the office. In particular, this house is designed through a process of folding a circular figure in order to produce implied subdivision and plan through this formal operation. This subdivision also helps to organize two residences within the same volume. The cone is folded successively onto itself, producing a disc that has a series of ridges. This was done a number of times, producing different kinds of conical folds with different levels of intensity. I should say that the conical folds are then intersected with planar folds that then produces a patterning on the surface. And so we did, these are just 4 studies, but we did a number of them looking at different ways in which the kind of graphic nature of this process would inform certain kinds of plan organizations. From these tests, we developed a final version that concentrates the formal complexity in 2 key moments. Conceptually, the house is defined by 2 horizontal planes, the roof and the ground plane. This also acts as a metaphor for the logic of assembly, where the house's walls are sandwiched between the ground plane and the stretched skin roof. The figure of fidelity is concentrated towards the roof as the defining element, with the rest of the spatial subdivision kept relatively simple. As with a lot of the previous work, really looking at the role of stress skins as a kind of enabling curvature and pre-assembly before getting to a site, alongside traditional practices of balloon framing and then most recently cross-laminated timber. The roof remains slightly oversized to provide a generous porch around the exterior of the building. The wraparound porch also provides a level of privacy that is distinct from the shared central courtyard. And so in this case, different levels of privacy are between interior and exterior are inverted. One thing, because of the roundness of the form, both externally and internally, rather than relying purely on the subdivision of the plan, you could use the curvature to make you feel like you're in different zones of the space. So using the geometry to make you feel like even though you're in one space, you feel like you're in two separate spaces. The public and private spaces of the two residences alternate in plan. And this is a kind of diagram of the public and private spaces. This is a kind of diagram of the roof. And then here we can see how the living areas are kind of open, and then the sleeping areas are compartmentalized into smaller rooms. And then this is just speculating on a series of ways of construction of how it might arrive to the site and be assembled. We're working with AKT and Hanif Kara on this research currently, and looking at certain manufacturers within North America that are starting to produce curved CLT exterior walls. And then these are some pretty schematic renderings looking at the relationship of the roof and the living spaces below, and that centralized courtyard. The next project I'd like to show is the Concord House. This project draws its name from both this location and perhaps its formal and programmatic concordance between disparate geometries and disparate subjects. The house is situated at a corner lot in which its property lines are not parallel. In thinking about the packing of three residences into a single volume, the main move is to think about introducing a degree of connection and separation. This is made possible by the introduction of the interior commons for the three residences contained within the volume. Geometrically, this takes the form of a circle, which contains a series of negotiating centers. On the one hand, an off-axis circle makes way for an access to a second level unit. There's a stair that connects both levels of the commons. That's another center. And then there's a third center that defines the commons itself. The entrances to each wing are placed tangently to the circular commons, and as a result, the two wings of the house are able to rotate around the commons to align and parallel with the respective lot edges. Three distinct residences organize the building inside the volume. The residents share formal and organizational logics, but they vary in size. So on the left is a two-story residence with its own internal staircase. On the right is a self-contained larger flat, and then upstairs is the second floor to the two-story single-family home, and then on the right is a smaller flat with its own entry staircase. At the roof, the commons is articulated through a gable figure that tucks into the roof in two distinct ways, creating a connection to the interior, and also redirecting light into the indirect light into the interior commons. As you move around the house on the exterior, you can see the conjunction of axial and centralized figures that make up the overall volume of the house. So here the front facade slowly bends and contorts the convex exterior, while the elevation on the back produces a concave corner and organizes most of the fenestration that lights the rooms on the interior. And so these are a few exterior perspectives looking at the continuity of metal siding. This is here we're looking at the entry and the driveway. And then here we can see how the interior drum of the commons faces is revealed in this framed opening to the backyard. And then above we can see there's a staircase in this slot here that allows for the dweller to get to their residence up here on the second story level. Inside the commons, we can see how the nested circulatory figures are concealed and revealed in various ways. So here we can see the circular staircase that connects the upper and lower levels of the commons, and that secondary staircase that gets you to the second story residence. The last and final project that I'll like to show tonight is the Barrow House. The project started with the iconographic arch, which is used as a means to produce both organizations and plan, as well as spatial distortions and section. The spine of the house is defined by 2 barrel vaults and a series of thick walls that produce the rooms. And then the areas of the house, the programmatic areas of the house, are articulated by the sloping planes that are visible and sandwiched between the thick walls. And they move between the center of the barrel vaults to the edge of the perimeter. And these are a few model shots showing the kind of character of those walls and the kind of tilting of the planes from the central barrel vaults to the perimeter walls. And then the short elevations are defined by inscribed into barrel vaults on the exterior in an abstract way, but produce this kind of embrasure or this kind of double negative moment that is both sculptural and bringing light into that central corridor. And so these are a series of exterior perspectives exploring materiality, in which the exterior is made of brick and the tilted planes are clad in standing seam metal siding. A perspective that is looking at that short elevation where the embrasure, the barrel vaults puncture that facade. The other long elevation, 3/4 view, and a kind of up close shot of the embrasure. In the plan, the house is organized into 4 quadrants. There's a quadrant for living, a quadrant for sleeping, and a quadrant for making large-scale studio art. These quadrants are connected by in-between spaces, which sit somewhere between a room and a corridor in scale. And these spaces are meant as kind of either quiet niches for solitary work or to kind of house certain kinds of back-of-the-house functions for the residents. And these are a series of perspectives or visualizations that we're doing at the moment, testing both the lighting quality and internal materiality. So here, this is at the entry where we enter into the main foyer that's defined by this square. And then along the long grain of the house, we can see the profiles of the barrel vault figures. This is looking towards the studio. This is looking towards the living room and the children's wing. An interior perspective of the living space. This is looking at the master bedroom suite. And looking in the corridor just outside of the master bedroom suite towards the dining room. This is a small study outside the children's bedroom. And this is a exterior perspective. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Sean. That's it's really exciting to see the work. Just the series of houses. I've been following the work on your website, but I think the last one I'm not familiar with. Really incredible stuff. Maybe we can, if you stop sharing, we'll see our audience. And
sure.
Would you be willing to take some questions?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So if anyone has any questions, we are in a regular Zoom meeting, so you could simply unmute yourself and ask a question. If you don't do that, then I'm asking questions, and that could get exhausting. Well, maybe I'll kick it off, Sean. Oh, Sarah, can you unmute?
Yeah, I changed it. I changed it like right when we started so people can unmute themselves. So you should be able to. Let me try it again.
Mark Northstar, you should be able to unmute.
Oh, okay. Got it. Try that now.
Now it's working.
Okay. Mark, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I was waiting for this since the beginning of the semester. Thank you so much. I'm curious about how you name your houses, like Art Farm, Round, Concord. I'm curious to hear from you. How do you name your houses?
Oh, I mean, I try to be as straightforward as possible. In the case of the Janus House, of course, that refers to Greek mythology of Janus, the double-faced figure, and also Janus head. So the idea of a house that shared a kind of twin facades just seemed appropriate in that case. The Concord House, the location was Concord, Massachusetts, but also because it was trying to kind of smuggle in 3 houses into one envelope, thinking of how the different geometries, the round and axial geometries are working together to do that, and also that there are 3 different subjects or 3 different family collectives that are living in this single volume. So a little cheesy in that case, but but I felt it was just kind of appropriate in 2 ways, both location and what I was trying to achieve there.
Any other questions?
Sean, thank you for an amazing presentation. Great body of work. So in your process, do you switch between 2D and 3D? Your diagrams sometimes are kind of in a 2-dimensional kind of compressed space, and other times it's extrusion of space. So do you switch back and forth? Are you dominant in the 3-dimensional? And also, when you're representing that, are you working in a 3D modeling, or is it actually on a piece of paper, like in a 2D kind of exploration of these forms?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Mostly a lot of digital modeling. I do occasionally have interns that are testing some of the things for me in physical modeling. I have one that I've been working with for quite a few summers now. There are certain very adept 3-dimensionally with these kinds of geometries, but there have been certain kinds of discoveries about working with them in 2D. So one of the things I like about working with the cone or cylinder is the ability to kind of flatten it and then project certain kinds of apertures back onto the 3-dimensional form in that flattened space that has been kind of productive for me. And for example, the Folly Pavilion, that what I call the gable tuck, where the teardrop opening and the pie shape opening was really figured out, or kind of the aha moment there was in flattening the cone and drawing on top of that, and then projecting that back into the 3-dimensional cone and engaging with the gable.
I'm going to follow up with, just to follow up quickly on that question of Jeff. Do the renderings, as you start to render the spaces like you extensively did in the last project, does that actually come back into the process to work towards this sort of redefinition of geometries as you're seeing effects through the rendering?
Absolutely. I mean, mostly, I think I'm in the kind of desire to build. I think before I was maybe using the renderings in maybe a graphic way, but now I'm using the renderings to really test certain kinds of materials and then folding that back into the drawings, particularly the plan. And then the question of thickness is always a problem, particularly the kinds of geometries that I like working with. And so, yeah, stickiness is always coming in, but the renderings allow me to get the effect first, and then to try to solve it through drawing or modeling.
Thanks. Bonnie, you had a question?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out the link between the Indigenous Peoples introduction and the lecture, and then about 3/4 of the way through, some of the patterning on the graphic explorations looked a lot like Acoma pottery. So I'm kind of curious about your explorations, which tend to be Eurocentric, I would say. And what this Indigenous introduction had to do with what you're talking about, if anything.
Well, so before Sean addresses, I think, the meat of the question, which I think is quite interesting, which relates to sourcing and connections through a kind of, histories of geometry and architecture, right? And the kind of chain of projects, which I think that the work absolutely exists within. My introduction at the beginning is separate from Sean's lecture, and that is now customary for us at CCA to recognize and acknowledge the land on which we work, both where our campuses are and where all of us are now, as we are distributed mostly locally, but not completely locally. So you should separate that, Bonnie, from Sean's presentation.
But it was kind of nice to have that and then see the patterning of the pottery from the Southwest. So that was just serendipitous.
Well, I've got one question. I think, well, foremost, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really enlightening. The drawings were pretty amazing. Thing that I noticed was that I think there was like a breadth of ideas that I think were pushed on to the actual practice of the design of the said buildings, be it buildings that were actually going to get built or research, I think, projects. And one question that I had was, how do you essentially navigate those two ends? I think one of the fears I have as a student is that moving on into practice, there might not be enough space to conceptually do some ideas that you have, but I think you've managed to find a distinct middle ground, and yeah.
I mean, I think that's a great question. I think that there's always a careful balance between maybe let's say the profession and the profession as maybe a service to someone else, and a kind of the discipline, which is maybe something that's motivated by other kinds of means or a kind of intellectual project. And so I think I've always been interested, and I certainly worked for a number of practices that were really maybe proactive about exploring their own intellectual project and then finding the opportunities where that might map onto a particular client brief. And sometimes those things don't always sync up together. But I do believe to some extent that our role as architects is also maybe to show and to open up our discipline to others in different ways, and that includes clients as well as like a larger kind of public. And so it's not I don't have a exact answer for you as I'm navigating this every day, but fortunately I'm in the space of academia that allows me to kind of carry on the intellectual project as I'm trying to get more built work or trying to get built work. And I think both are really important for me.
Can I maybe return, Sean, to I think that the second part of Bonnie's question, and maybe to rephrase a little bit, but could you maybe speak to the consciousness in the work? And you did at the beginning where you spoke to the kind of Robin Evans and the Delorme and you know, how you or situating some of your investigations within a history of the sort of geometry as it pushes against and is shaped by tectonics, right, and material. But I see in the work, I mean, I don't want to name them because my naming of certain connections would probably be different than yours, but could you maybe elaborate a little bit on how you situate the work in the kind of disciplinary series of relationships? Or maybe better, I think, and this might be better for our students, your relationship or your kind of network of let's say intellectual, creative sounding boards, and I don't mean literally like people you're talking to, but people that you believe your work is talking to in contemporary practices. Either or.
Yeah. I mean, I would say I was always kind of maybe interested in a formal project of architecture, and I think it took me some time to realize how maybe the formal and the social are always kind of connected. And maybe that's a kind of conscious. I think now that's a kind of conscious effort to kind of maybe to try not to work on single family houses, and to try to think about new models of collectivity and new types of collectivity. But it does come by way of geometry, which I think is a disciplinary project, and perhaps has been maybe not as important as of recently, and maybe trying to open that up a little bit. So I would say, I mean, certainly, you know, Scott Cohen, certainly my work with Craig and Lisa, certainly Shinohara is someone that I'm thinking about, and the way in which he was able to kind of, I would say, use exceptional forms in non-exceptional spaces, but in a really kind of dumb way, in a really banal way, that I think makes his buildings quite special. So Shinohara is definitely in my mind a lot. But also that kind of precision of, let's say, the Scott Cohen canon.
Yeah, Shinohara was one that I was very conscious of. Does anyone else have a question for Sean?
I have a question, Sean. This is Joe, and I love your geometries and I've enjoyed this talk a lot. I was wondering, you kept mentioning the, you know, in the Rome and these infill projects and the geometries that were derived from the spaces around them, but then almost all of your projects, except for the early ones inside the museum, are out in the middle of space and don't have another reference that bring in. You're kind of creating all these geometries, and I'm wondering why that is, and are you interested in infill, or are you interested in objects? You know, where does that, where are you?
I'm actually both. So I sort of I think I did a series of research last summer on irregular infills, looking at kind of overlooked sites in Philadelphia, and trying to find opportunities for collective housing there, and a different kind of CLT, community land trust as a means of enabling that kind of building. But I always refer back to that Furness project, because I find that the Furness project is pretty wonderful in the limitations of the site, that he was still able to produce that much exception, or that much exuberance within that tight footprint. So I guess I just haven't come across the opportunity to work in a more urban context yet, but I'm certainly edging towards that. They come with different kinds of pressures, obviously, but both, yeah, for sure. Hopefully that answered your question a little bit.
Hey, Sean, this is Jason Kelly Johnson. It's great to see your work. Can you hear me?
Hey, Jason. Yeah, I can hear you.
Awesome, man. And so inspiring. And, you know, the students are so excited that to sort of see you and hear your voice and see where you're heading with your practice. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your approach to teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been having discussions as a faculty a little bit about, you know, how you know, there's new models that are emerging and kind of thinking through a little bit how we might sort of shift teaching. The world is I think changing in really radical and interesting and problematic ways. And I'm just curious about how you structure pedagogy in response to your experiences, your interests, and how you see sort of the future of architecture. And also everyone's sort of really interested in how maybe your experiences at CCA and then Harvard and elsewhere sort of affected that. I'm just curious if you've had any critical thoughts about the great things about your education and the things that you felt were shortcomings, and how you've sort of approached it in your own way. Thanks.
That's a tough question. I think I guess my approach to teaching now is I certainly this semester coordinating Core 1 at the GSD, I think me and my colleagues have really tried to kind of maybe show how the formal project and the social project are perhaps interrelated. And so, you know, the students they have a series of very concise briefs that are focusing in very precise ways, you know, certain kinds of problems and lessons to learn within architecture, and trying to open up maybe some of the discourse in the canon at a number of levels, both in terms of, I mean, everyone's doing this right now, but I think we really made a lot of effort in terms of the readings, in terms of the range of precedents that we're looking at, and probably more collective effort in researching or working through things together. So at the start of each brief, I like to do a brainstorming with my entire studio versus do one-on-ones, and I always try to make the studio feel like a family each semester. So rather than you're off in your own world and you're off in your own world, that we're all working towards on this problem together. I don't think that's something that I had so much in both my at CCA and even certainly not at the GSD when I was there. It was every man for themselves, and so I try to use each course to kind of feel like a unit, but also try to show the students as much as possible different kinds of precedents from different kinds of context, and to talk through those precedents both formally and both in terms of program and both in terms of context and in terms of certain kinds of environmental pressures. Yeah, I mean, I haven't really thought about that. I mean, it's certainly very hands-on. I think I have a very hands-on approach, both in terms of showing students things, techniques, in terms of precedents, but also getting the students to work together, even though they might be working on their own individual projects. But to think like when you're in Sean Canty section, we're all working together. We're not doing our own thing. So it makes it funner too. It makes it fun as well.
That's great. Thank you. Great response.
We probably have time for one more. If anyone has something pressing they want to ask Sean, or not so pressing as the case may be.
Sean, can I ask another question, please?
I can. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. It's okay, Mark. No, so I was wondering, honestly, how like the contractors or like the building systems in the US limits your geometries. I don't know, like it's so interesting geometries, and I think you might have this situation with the market itself. So how in your mind you're gonna go, like what approach you're gonna take to make this like being realized? I don't know.
Well, I think maybe a little bit to answer that question is there's a kind of I think in each project there's a kind of moment of high fidelity in which like an area of the project where those geometries are concentrated, so everything else is mostly normative in that sense, and therefore we can kind of anticipate ahead of time. Let's say for the art farmhouse, we brought the contractor on, the consultants on a lot earlier in the process than we would normally because of the budget and because of the site, and to concentrate those moments of what I call high figural fidelity into concise areas, so that they're not everywhere. Things can be really mundane, and to be really strategic about where, let's say, architecture exists. On the other hand, there's a kind of more proactive approach that I'm doing right now, and that's working with, AKT's structural engineering and Hanif Kara and his research branch at looking at different prefabricated methods of dealing with curvature in wood frame construction that might then map onto future applications of projects in North America. So rather than kind of waiting for a client or waiting for a particular project to kind of come into the office to figure those things out, is to kind of figure them out ahead of time, so that when those situations come, there's a set of solutions and ways of working that won't inhibit the project in any way.
Great, thank you. Great.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, we have time for one more if you want to ask your question.
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate that. I want to talk about lines. I really enjoyed how you composed them. And for me as a student, and I'm sure many students, we talk about rendering. And I would like to hear from you what's your idea about digital fabrication and rendering? In your presentation, it's amazing how you brought the line weight and how you compose that into an actual building. But what do you think about you teaching students about like digital rendering with that?
Did you say line weight or light, or both?
Line, yeah.
Line.
Lines.
Line weight. Oh, I see. Oh, that's well, I think on the one hand, the geometries that I'm using, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the reason why I like using them is because they have both straight lines and they have curved lines, and somehow I like to maybe perhaps reveal that in the kind of final material organization of the project, either through some normative material like clapboard siding or standing seam siding or even brick. So somehow using the kind of curves that are embedded within the geometry to organize, sheet material in particular ways. And then of course these geometries have other kinds of curves that aren't just the kind of the circles, the ellipse, or the parabolas, but geodesics that are short path curves along their surfaces that can also be unrolled. So somehow it's like kind of revealing the innate qualities of those geometries and organizing certain sheet materials that we work with on a day-to-day. Where let's say like a double curved surface, you would have to kind of figure out how to make those into flat parts, or how to subdivide that, or to kind of reapproximate that into flat parts. And so the nice thing about working with single curved surfaces is that there's already a logic in terms of how they're operating.
Okay.
Mark Donahue. Sorry, I have to say hi to Mark Donahue because It's great to see you, Mark.
Mark is just coming out of class, I think. Yeah. Well, Mark, it's recorded, so you can watch this amazing talk at your leisure, as they say. Do you want to say anything, Mark?
I'm so sorry I missed your talk. I've been looking at your website over and over again. I really love the work. It's been fantastic to see it and to watch your development over the years. I must say it's been absolutely amazing. And I think you've just done such a fabulous job of honing your skills and abilities and ideas over the years. And I think it's gotten incredibly eloquent the way you're beginning to work with the things that you're doing. And congratulations on winning a bunch of, well, I think we're going to be going to London, I think, shortly, or if you haven't gone already. So congratulations on that. It's going to be a wonderful time. But I think that you've got a real incredible story that you're working through to bring all the work that you've done over the years together. So congratulations. It's looking good.
Thanks, Mark.
You're doing us
Great
proud.
seeing you.
Yeah, it really is. So I don't have the deep connection with you, Sean, because I'm just 2.5 years out here. But I'm absolutely part of the fan club. I think the work is just phenomenal, elegant, and I guess I like obsessions in architecture, and clearly you are obsessed, and it shows in the work. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. I would love at a later date offline to have a conversation with you about how we squeeze collectives into things that maybe vaguely look like single family houses, which at least what we saw tonight. I think it's a really interesting project on the social side. And I think you're absolutely right in the way that maps into geometries and the way geometries give shape to collectivity, right? Or can, if we are conscious about them. And I think the consciousness that you bring to bear upon your work is inspiring. So thank you so much again for coming back out here. I wish that COVID was not present and that we actually had you out here and we could all now go out for a nice dinner and some drinks, but we'll do that in the future.
Yes. Okay.
So,
thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sean. Great to see.
We're just gonna clap.
Yeah.
Oops, sorry.